Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of the Create HDR series for this year. My name's Sue Olovich, and it's a real pleasure to be hosting the session today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I work and learn today. I'm on the land of the Darawal people and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I particularly recognise and celebrate the artistic practices of storytelling, dance, music, and visual art that Indigenous peoples have engaged in for millennia. And I acknowledge how these practices sustain communities, validate experiences, nurture relationships, and serve as essential forms of cultural continuity for First Nations. And finally, I extend deep respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are with us today or watching on the recording. And I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. You might like to acknowledge the land upon which you're joining us today. So as many of you know, our sessions begin with a presentation from a colleague in the fields of arts research, and we follow this by to ask questions and share our wonderings. So as Thomas is presenting today, you might have some wonderings or some curiosities, and I really encourage you to pop them into the chat and we can explore them at the end of the session. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Thomas. Some of you may remember Thomas from previous Create HDR sessions where he's presented before. Thomas is a playwright, a researcher, and a theatre maker. And since 2018, Thomas has worked at the University of Sydney as a lecturer and tutor and is currently completing a PhD and academic fellowship with the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. He's also the research associate strategic projects at the Create Centre. And as you know, the Create Centre is a research centre based at the University of Sydney that investigates the impact of the arts on education, health and wellbeing. And Thomas is the artistic director also of BBT, a theatre company that produces original Australian work for the stage and runs community arts workshops for young people. You're a very busy person there, Thomas. So in today's session, Thomas is going to explore environmental awareness through applied site-specific theatre, and he'll share with us about Regrowth, an applied site-specific theatre workshop which engaged young participants in a creative process that highlighted the urgent issues of climate change and environmental degradation. And through drama processes and theatre making exercises, improvisation and collaborative scene creation, participants reflected on their personal and community experiences related to the environment. The performance that the participants created during the workshop was set in a dystopian future where Earth has suffered severe ecological damage, serving as a powerful backdrop for exploring themes of sustainability, of resilience, and of social justice. And by integrating these environmental concerns into the performance, the project educated and empowered participants, fostering a deeper understanding and commitment to environmental awareness within the broader community. So without any further ado, I can't wait to hear your presentation, Thomas, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Sue. It's my great pleasure to be here. And I'm joining from Gadigal land. And this research project took place on Gadigal land, but also in the Yuin Nation, which essentially runs from Wetherill Tops all the way down to Eden. It's the Yuin Nation. It's a very large Aboriginal nation, and you might know it as the south coast or the far south coast of New South Wales, and that was where all of the theatre making took place for this project, Regrowth. So today I'm going to be giving you a little bit of a background on the project that was the focus of my PhD, which was the Regrowth project. And then I'm going to be talking about a concept called environmental sense making. And I'm going to be sharing a couple of interesting kind of data points that emerged out of the data analysis from data collected through my PhD research. And then we can have some questions at the end. It's really great to be presenting today, roughly a year since I last presented. And at that stage for the HDR huddle, I focused mainly on my methods and methodology and had some data to comment on. But at this stage in my HDR journey, I can be a little bit more expansive about what the data says and how I've interpreted it and what I think some sort of conclusions are around the involvement of these young people in this theatre making project. As Sue very kindly elucidated at the beginning of our session today, Regrowth was a site-specific applied theatre workshop, which was principally designed to empower young people in the south coast of New South Wales following the Black Summer bushfires of 2019 and 2020. And one of the kind of results of this workshop process was that the young people were given the opportunity to explore environmental themes as well as their own identities through drama and through these applied theatre making processes. Some of the activities that the participants engaged in were classic drama exercises that you would find in any conventional drama workshop or drama classroom, and others were designed and created to kind of tailor the workshop process towards generating content for a performance that took place at the end of the workshop that essentially asked the young people involved to consider their relationship to the site, which for the purposes of the workshop encompassed not just the place we were doing the workshop, but also the broader region, the broader community, their home as well. The thing that is important to note about Regrowth workshops is that we were very conscious of not trying to drive the thematic direction of the performance that was created. We really handed the responsibility of what the content of the performance was over to the young people who were involved in the workshop. Invariably, despite going to sort of great lengths to avoid kind of directing the thematic concerns of the performance, invariably the performances ended up having something to do with either environmental awareness or climate anxiety and community resilience. And this was, in my opinion, a direct result of the recent trauma that had occurred on the South Coast. And that trauma really encompasses a couple of things. It was the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires, followed by some pretty devastating flooding events, and then also the COVID-19 pandemic. These were massively disruptive events that took place on the South Coast and within the environment that these young people live and make their lives. And the workshop that we did in Pambula, which is a very small and beautiful town between sort of Bermagui and Eden on the South Coast, the performance that was created in that workshop was titled by the participants as The Fight for Our Future. It ended up being quite a political piece, and it was really, it was the largest workshop that we conducted over the course of the entire project with just under 30 participants. And it was an incredible experience to work with these young people and to essentially teach them skills that allowed them to use their voice in performance, to talk about the things and to perform about the things that were of great import to them. It's a 6-day drama skills workshop, and it essentially culminates in the performance for the local community. And like I said before, the participants are taught drama skills, strategies in storytelling, improvisation, character building. There's writing techniques are taught, as well as vocal techniques and movement. The skills development process is really focused on providing participants with the tools they need to devise a performance based on their experiences as young people. And these drama skills are essentially transferable skills as well. You know, they can be useful in a variety of contexts, not just in sort of artistic performance and the performing arts. The thing that I kind of want to take a moment to explore with you is, because of the nature of the rural and remote environment that these young people live in, access to quality arts, particularly quality performing arts, is extremely limited. And so we were often met with young people who had some experience in the performing arts, had maybe done a school play or two, Some of them were fortunate enough to have a drama teacher at their school, and then some participants had had no experience with drama before and were coming into these workshops with very few skills in drama and performance. The other thing that Sue mentioned that I just wanted to touch on was that this work kind of emerges out of work that I've been doing with my theatre company for quite a while now. From sort of 2016 onwards, we have been developing and producing site-specific theatre with a particular focus on opera, the first of which was Chamber Pot Opera, which you can see a picture of there on the left. It was a pastiche opera set inside an actual ladies' bathroom, and the final performance of that show took place in the ladies' bathroom at the Sydney Opera House. And late last year, in November and December 2023, Trackworks, which was another site-specific opera that was staged at Sydney's Mortuary Station, was another site-specific performance, another pastiche opera. So this is work that I feel very at home in, although these were site-specific operas, working in locations and creating theatre using the sites that we occupy and the hidden elements and the kind of evocative parts of the sites that we occupy is a skill that I have been working in and a kind of context that I've been working in for quite some time. This gives you a sense of where the workshops took place over the course of the project. So we started as far north as Browley, which is just north of Maruya, but south of Batemans Bay. And we did workshops also in Badalla, Narooma, Tathra, and then finally Pambula. It's a massive area to kind of cover. To drive from Batemans Bay to Pambula takes 2 hours, and Batemans Bay is roughly 4 hours south of Sydney. So we're talking about a region that, although has pockets of advantage, suffers from all of the kinds of classic deprivations that rural and remote areas and the regions suffer from. Limited access to services, a rental crisis, cost of living pressures, and increasingly the communities on the South Coast are overexposed to the impacts of climate change. And to give you some insight into just how devastating those bushfires were in 2019, 2020, we're talking about an impact. 5.5 million hectares of land was burnt over the course of that sort of 2-month period. 26 lives were lost and 2,448 homes were absolutely destroyed, and that doesn't include the impacts that were perhaps softer, and in dealing with and in talking with the participants at these workshops, their recollections of the bushfire experience were redolent of trauma and dismay and fear that it would happen again. And although it was never our objective to therapize the young people who were involved in our workshops, it was clear from data collected throughout the project that they experienced some therapeutic, not therapy, but therapeutic kind of effects from being given a platform and being given a voice. And I won't be talking about that in depth today. I'm really going to focus on the ways in which the workshop enabled the young people involved to make sense of their environment through drama. So, as I said, the region contains one of the highest concentrations of unemployed people and people living below the poverty line in Australia. The South Coast region, following the fires, experienced 7 more declared natural disasters, with floods through February, July, August, October, and December 2020, and March and May 2021. And of course, the young people's lives were thoroughly disrupted, as all our lives were during the COVID-19 pandemic, requiring them to continue their schooling online. So this was the context in which we began this work. So I just want to introduce a couple of key concepts that have been really useful to me as I've tried to kind of make sense myself of the data that I collected throughout this research project. Environmental awareness is a concept where we're recognizing human impacts on the environment and addressing climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss through artistic expression. That's the kind of context and framing that I use for the purposes of this research. When I'm talking about environmental awareness, I'm talking about that recognition that the participants undertake and that they express through their artistry and performance. When I'm talking about personal narratives, I'm talking about the individual stories of participants that reflect their unique backgrounds and perspectives. These narratives are linked to personal memories and beliefs, and they can also encompass broader cultural and environmental contexts. This is the kind of area of my presentation today that I'm going to kind of get into the weeds of. And it was these two concepts that essentially, when working kind of interrelatedly, allowed the participants to make sense of not just who they were in relation to one another and the site in which they were working, but also to make sense of the experiences of being exposed to climate change and their experiences of climate anxiety. Obviously, a workshop that was titled Regrowth hinted in some oblique way at natural disasters, but we really went to great lengths to avoid kind of directing or pushing the content of the show towards it being about environmental issues. And so we hoped that that was a significantly metaphorical enough title for the workshops. As I've already said, participants tended to gravitate towards environmental themes, and what they created at Pambula was a political and climate-focused performance. Interestingly enough, recent scholarly research on youth eco-anxiety really played a kind of significant role in informing this thesis on why youth address climate issues through drama. And it's in part driven by the fact that it's one of their major concerns in general. The research shows that young people are predominantly affected, predominantly preoccupied with issues around eco-anxiety, and that the Hickman et al. Article in particular looked at the ways in which arts-rich processes and arts-rich activities tend to make the kind of space that young people enjoy using to talk about eco-anxiety. When I'm talking about sense-making, I'm talking about understanding and finding meaning in experiences, particularly through collective and narrative processes. And I take that definition from Bruner. Sense-making is viewed as a semiotic organisation to cope with complex topics. And these definitions kind of emerge out of education, out of the field of education. And I apply them here within a kind of performing arts and applied theatre context, because there was a degree of learning that took place throughout the workshops. Young people were attempting in their own way and through the arts processes that we facilitated through the workshop, to try and essentially make sense of quite complex ideas. The semiotic organisation that they undertook would have been things like standing in a certain position on stage, or saying a certain line, or acting in a certain way. Those were the kind of signs that they used to indicate their kind of sense-making around these complex topics. In other contexts, sense-making can take the form of, it can be applied differently. But for the purposes of this research, that's my definition, and the definition that I've used throughout the analysis. Last time I spoke to this group, I talked a lot about the method that I employed throughout this research. And basically, the gathering data process that I relied on was one of the major parts of it was a sequence of semi-structured interviews conducted at 3 key stages: pre-workshop, during the workshop, and post-workshop. This approach obviously allowed for a more in-depth and a slight longitudinal examination of how participants' perspectives and their conceptual understandings evolved throughout the workshop. So I asked 2 key questions at 3 different times throughout the workshop, and I'm just going to focus on one of those key questions. And the key question that relates to environmental sense-making essentially was, how could we, if I was asking it before the workshop, or are we, or did we make theatre about your home? And so the pre-workshop interviews focused on establishing a baseline understanding of participants' initial thoughts and personal relationships to the workshop themes, and in particular, their conceptualizations of home, environment, and community. And through the interview process, we were able to kind of explore their existing associations and experiences. And I was able to capture that and their natural, uninfluenced views and expectations before they'd even participated in the workshop. And so this stage essentially identified participants' starting points and gave some insight into also their prior experiences with drama and their motivations for participating in the workshop. When it came to a during workshop interview, these allowed for real-time reflections as participants actively engaged in the drama and theatre making processes. So at this point in the process, participants are sharing insights into their evolving thoughts, their new skills, and also, and critically, the shifts in their understanding of home and environment. And so these interviews at the midway point were pretty invaluable for capturing transitional moments as participants began to essentially articulate newfound perspectives, as well as making sort of having the opportunity to make connections to the themes that we were exploring in the workshop. For me, it offered a window into the impact of specific exercises that we were doing in the workshop, as well as what the young people had been kind of interacting collaboratively on with their peers in the workshop. And during the post-workshop interviews, essentially I was asking the young people to kind of essentially reflect on the entire experience. And this gave the participants an opportunity to discuss how the workshop had influenced their final perspectives and broader conceptual frameworks around home and indeed the environment. So these interviews were geared towards trying to gauge the lasting impact of the workshop on the environment, on the participants' environmental awareness, as well as their connection to both personal and universal concepts of home. And you can see that just in this sample that I'm showing you, there is a shift in the conceptualization from something quite personal to something quite universal. And so the final interview really provides space for the participants to reflect on their growth as well throughout the workshop, and an opportunity to articulate, I guess, the most meaningful aspects of their experience. It's also at this point in the process possible to identify the significant shifts in understanding, and if there are kind of lasting changes in their outlook. So to kind of put it very briefly, to kind of give you just a couple of extracts from those interview processes. Basically, participants' understanding of home shifted really significantly, evolving from, as I said earlier, a personal and local perspective to a more universal and communal one as a result of participating in the workshop. And so initially, participants like JR saw home as grounded in immediate personal surroundings. Another participant, IM, spoke of if we were going to make theatre about home, then we'd need certain kitchen materials, we'd need the beach, and JR was kind of preoccupied with ideas of friends and family. And so again, this early sense of home was familiar, specific, and reflected the physical environments and personal connections of the participants. Roughly 2 weeks later, and after a few days in the workshop, the interviews began to reveal broadening perspective. So LC, for instance, another subject, shared that the collaborative nature of the ensemble fostered a new awareness of home as connected to a larger societal context. And they described an increasing awareness of interconnectedness. Again, we were seeing like a slightly expanded view, and they were able to make the connection that this was encouraged by drama activities that explored community and shared experiences, required collaboration, required working in an ensemble of like-minded participants that also lived in their area, which facilitated a deeper and a more communal understanding of home, because that had been the kind of discussions that had been taking place throughout the workshop, that somebody else shared my experience of home. Home had to encompass that other person's experience as well. By the end of the workshop, participants are now conceptualizing home in very universal and particularly abstracted terms. And LD, for example, described how the exaggerated portrayal of home in the final performance acts as an allegory for the real world, which was a really interesting thing for that participant to have kind of arrived at, because they were able to understand that the audience was going to connect with the thematic ideas behind the show rather than the specific home that was being depicted on stage. They were able to kind of essentially understand that what they were depicting on stage was allegorical, and we didn't need to kind of render their kitchen, their beach in specific forms. It also had there were kind of other aspects of this increased and broadened conceptualization. For example, MP was able to emphasize a collective responsibility, having viewed the planet as a shared home now for all generations, because that was the content of the show. The show involved, the original inhabitants of Earth having to leave because Earth was decaying and arriving on a new planet, and what the impacts on each of those generations was. So I want to talk a little bit about the processes that were used to essentially help participants connect with environmental themes. And I'll just take one example of a very kind of classic exercise in drama classes. It's an exercise called Death in a Minute, where participants essentially improvise a scenario. They're given a couple of boundaries. We might say you're in a jungle and your relationship with your scene partner is your brother and sister, and you're running out of water. And you have to one of you has to die in less than a minute, and it has to be accidental, and extra points if you can make it funny. And so essentially what we're teaching participants in this exercise is structure and dramatic tension in a very fun and engaging way. And through these exercises and exercises like that, participants began to see the potential for stories, I should say, to convey complex ideas and emotions. And as participants progress throughout the workshop, this understanding evolves into a way of expressing urgent environmental concerns. So by the end of the workshop, participants are not just learning storytelling for its own sake, they're actively using that storytelling skill to voice their anxieties and insights about issues like climate change, pollution, and sustainability. During the workshop, participants began weaving together their personal experiences and their environmental concerns into the plot of the final performance of the show. Many of them made connections between their own lives, their community, and the broader issue of climate change. This approach helped them see environmental issues as directly relevant to their lives rather than abstract or distant concerns. And it's a good example of how applied theatre, allowing young people to make sense of their world, allowing young people to drive the narrative of the show that they're creating, accomplishes, essentially allows them to represent their views on what they see as their environmental crisis. And this kind of integration, it doesn't just enrich the story by making it highly personal to the young people who are participating. It also positions it as, in this particular context, something universal that then gets presented to the community that comes and witnesses the performance on the final night. Through their experiences in the workshop, participants' reflections on storytelling evolved. Initially, they saw stories as ways to share knowledge, and over time, they recognized them as a means to explore the complexities of social issues like the environmental crisis that they had just experienced. Because we had set up the workshop as a kind of iterative process, a very supportive kind of ensemble and context, this really gave the participants the opportunity to fail, sort of experiment with their choices around what scenes might look like, and to experiment also with different kind of formats for the stories that they were going to be telling. For example, one of the participants, MP, their understanding really developed as they explored how stories could reveal, and this is a quote from their interview, that it was very important for the evolution of humanity itself. So they were able to explore how stories could reveal real social and environmental issues. my view is that this shift in perception points to storytelling as both an accessible means of communication, as well as a way to grapple with the intricacies of issues that deeply affect a person's community and their lives. So through their time in the workshop, participants' reflections on storytelling changed from initially seeing them as ways to just share knowledge, and over time recognize them as a means to explore complexities of social issues. It was also clear that participants wanted their performance to act as a kind of cautionary tale, as this was brought up as in terms of talking about the story as an allegory, because they were very interested in kind of warning future generations, and indeed the people that came and saw their show, of the potential consequences of environmental degradation, and if it continued unchecked. And this was kind of brought up directly in interviews with MP in particular, who stated that it's important to see what the possibilities of our future could be. So this statement, in my view, and the performance that followed, underscored a vision of the future that the participant wanted to avoid, even though they were kind of platforming it by putting it on stage. In my opinion, and from what I can gather from this data, it seems that the young participants viewed the performance as an opportunity to influence change by reminding the audience, many of whom were older, of the urgency of the climate crisis. This urgency came through not only in the story of the final performance, but in the participants' conviction that they could convey an important message through theatre. They also chose a science fiction genre for their final performance, which allowed them to explore what they kind of described as a new look on Earth. They used the genre of sci-fi, which they had been introduced to through the workshop, to imagine alternative realities and explore worst-case environmental scenarios. This choice emerged completely naturally, without explicit direction from the facilitators, and it showed the participants' grasp of, as I said, allegory, and also its potential to communicate pressing environmental issues. When the participants situated their story in a speculative framework, they could approach real-world problems like pollution and ecological collapse in a way that was creative, engaging, and thought-provoking for their audience, and indeed for themselves. The other thing to remember is that the final performance was structured to highlight the roles of different social groups. So there were kind of two classes of people that were at play within the performance, and they were billionaires or scientists. And this was, in my view, an indication of how the participants were able to reflect systemic factors that result from environmental policies and crises. Through the performance, the participants were able to explore these power dynamics, and they critiqued the socio-political structures that drive environmental degradation. For example, they would portray kind of wealthy, influential figures like billionaires and represent them as having the power to shape environmental policy, but kind of flooding the opportunity, while scientist characters symbolized voices for ecological preservation. And so this artistic choice that participants made showed that their awareness of the complex social systems that influence environmental issues had become kind of broader, and it allowed them to use their characters as the lens through which they could communicate the broader message of their performance. Interestingly, a lot of the participants were able to kind of share that they found it easier to relate to the working class characters in their story because they knew already how they felt. And this identification with characters facing economic and social challenges allowed participants to represent the environmental crisis through an accessible, perhaps even empathetic lens. By grounding their narrative in familiar socioeconomic experiences, the participants are able to convey the effects of environmental issues in ways that resonate with their own experiences and also the perspectives of a diverse audience, many of whom they live amongst in that community. And so this approach really kind of exemplifies the social awareness and empathy that were fostered through their characterization choices, that they were able to kind of get a better sense and a deeper sense of what it's like to be part of a working class, or even what it's like to be part of a kind of billionaire class in the context of this environmental degradation. So to kind of summarize, essentially Regrowth provided a space for young people to use narrative-driven sense-making to build environmental awareness and understanding of the world around them. Participants connected their experiences of community with global ecological issues, and this created a performance that was both personally meaningful and socially relevant. I think that it is an affordance of site-specific theatre that allows this to occur, because what I witnessed was young participants essentially harnessing the transformative potential of theatre making and storytelling to advocate for awareness, for change, and for a sustainable future, to learn about their experiences as young people in the face of environmental disaster, and essentially to create a final performance that encapsulates that journey and that experience. It was a strong public statement that they made, and I think that the young people were really aiming to inspire reflection and potentially even action within their community. And now I'd like to take any questions if there are any.
Thomas, I so enjoyed your presentation, and I couldn't help but think just what a lot has gone on since we last met at the end of last year, and you were presenting, and you were deep in your analysis because you were showing us so many of the sample interviews of the pre and the during and the post workshops and so on. And I guess I'd love to start with the question, if people are thinking about framing a question to ask Thomas, but mine's actually from the perspective of you as a researcher, and what did you notice about yourself over the last year, from moving from being deeply in that analysis phase of the data to now where you've pulled sort of these beautiful themes from the data, and you actually in sort of the last stretch of the PhD. Were there particular times during the year where there were significant moments where you had clarity, where you had surprises, where you had questioning? I'm really curious from the perspective of you over the last year.
I think I was very fortunate to be working on a project that I got to really swim in for a long time. I think I had the same level of immersion in the workshop process that the young people did, and I think that made me deeply aware of the processes and essentially what was going on at a kind of minute-by-minute level. And it's therefore been quite easy, I think, to reflect on that experience of being there and conducting those workshops and facilitating them with the young people, and to remember quite easily what was kind of going on in the room at the time. I obviously, I have kind of hours and hours of GoPro footage of the workshop that I've rewatched to kind of relive it, and to, essentially re-observe what the participants were doing. But in my estimation, the kind of aha moments or the kind of eureka moments for this research have come from thinking, I suppose, deeply around, what I can see some changes happening in just the way that these young people are talking about fairly abstract and complex topics. Where did this occur and why did this occur? And finding, key moments in the workshop, whether they be in the form of kind of drama exercises or drama processes that we engaged in, or even just little comments that were made during the semi-structured interviews. Those moments were quite rewarding because they really elucidate and illuminate the kind of magic of this process that I think we really take for granted, theatre making and applied theatre making.
Yeah, so true. And Robin speaks to that. She's had to jump off now, but she's said in the chat, thank you so much for this interesting and insightful research. We so often underestimate young people, and your participants' reflections in the actual performance demonstrate how environmentally aware they are. The process of theatre making is so powerful. I think she captures what you've just shared there, Thomas. And Jeremy, feel free, Jeremy, if you'd like to unmute and ask the question. Otherwise, I can ask it on your behalf. So I'm happy to ask it. How did you look after your young people's feelings, especially reliving traumatic experiences and memories, and your own feelings as a researcher deeply involved in the process and potentially soaking up those feelings too? Can you talk us through a little bit of that, Thomas? That's fascinating.
Well, we were lucky. Yeah, we were lucky to partner with a local community services organisation
Mm,
that aged that aided us in the process of finding participants for the workshop, and they were primarily their role within the workshop was to ensure that if anyone kind of needed additional support in relation to any kind of traumatic experiences, that they were kind of there on hand.
mm,
Um, I have to kind of say though that we didn't really encounter the kinds of we didn't have any kind of traumatic episodes within the workshop. They were primarily kind of fun, engaged, enthusiastic spaces, and we did make a conscious effort to avoid essentially re-traumatizing the young people by getting them to kind of reflect on what it was like to live through the bushfires. They were often very forthcoming with those experiences. We really didn't try and facilitate the airing of those experiences because I'm not really equipped to, I guess, deal with those if they do become problematic in some way.
mm,
So yeah, it was, I think in general, we were quite fortunate that we had a group of young people that were just really engaged and excited. And we were lucky, I suppose, that they were happy to participate and engage with, environmental issues that were kind of so clearly connected to the bushfires. But we didn't yeah, we had probably too much fun, I think, to get bogged down in recollecting how awful those experiences were. I know I go on about it in my presentation, but it really is just to frame kind of the context in which we were working. Yeah,
yeah, fantastic. And Jeremy's just given you a little emoji there, a little clapping emoji. Um,
thanks.
any other questions?
Hi. Hi,
Hi, Kina.
Susan.
How are
Hey,
you?
Thomas. Hi, Jeremy. Hi. I'm joining this meeting from China, Nanjing.
Welcome.
Um, Thank you. And I want to thank Thomas for this wonderful sharing. And I think it's a great project, and I believe it's so meaningful, especially for those young people. And I have two questions. First, is very specific. I can see from the pictures they are not very young, or because my participants are primary school students. I want to ask specifically how how old are they, or middle school, high school? How old?
Yeah, the young people were 12 to 17 years old. And I think there was actually one 11-year-old in that Pambula workshop in the end. I think the kind of median age was about 15. And
Mm,
we don't, the reason why we kind of put the 12 years sort of cut off is we just find that there's when a 17-year-old's kind of happy to work with a 12-year-old, but they're not always happy to work with a 7-year-old. And so because so much of it is about ensemble building, we kind of want to kind of get at least the beginnings of that adolescent maturity kind of existing in the ensemble. And that tends to work quite well.
Mm.
yeah. Thank you. And another question is because I'm doing my field work right now, and I found I already have some anticipate outcomes for my research. And I wonder, what about yours? I've seen those amazing outcomes, especially the change from the small, relatively small concept of home to broader concept of home. Do you have any anticipate outcomes, or all of these outcomes are surprised you, or you kind of know it before you do it?
The three major findings from my research are that the young people who participated in the workshop reported that they felt more confident as a result of participating, that they felt that they were better able to express themselves and understand issues of the environment and around the environment. And the third thing that they took away from the workshop is that they developed stronger social connections to not just each other within the workshop, but also to their community. And I think it is the third thing that I was most surprised about. I wasn't anticipating that, although it makes sense to me now and on reflection, but when I began to kind of analyze some of the responses that I was getting, it became clear to me that as a result of emphasizing the site-specific nature of the processes by reorienting the young people's attention toward their relationship with site, and site in the broadest possible context, they were essentially building a relationship with that site and everybody that occupied it. So as a result of then sharing their performance to the community, they felt as though they had developed a bigger, better connection to their community. And I found that really interesting and something that I hadn't really anticipated.
Fantastic question. Yeah, thanks so much for asking them. And all the very best with your research project as well. Look, thank you everyone for coming along today and for participating so beautifully in the session. And a huge thank you to Thomas for being so generous in taking the time to share your journey, but also to give us insight into what it's been like for you over the last year as well in finalising your research. So our final, second last session, actually, our final online session is going to be on Thursday, the 14th of November. It's actually going to be at 9 a.m. in the morning, Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time. And that's because we have a presenter from Canada, from Toronto in Canada, who's going to present, Christy Smith. So Thursday, the 14th of November is our next online session. And just a heads up for our very final session of the year, I know some of you, because you're joining from overseas, won't be able to make it in person, but it's actually going to be held in person on Thursday, the 28th of November, at the University of Sydney. So if you do happen to be watching this recording and you are based in Sydney, we'd love to have you come along. There'll be a presentation and also some refreshments afterwards at the University of Sydney, and it will start at 4 o'clock. So thank you everyone for coming along today. Hopefully we'll be able to see you at our next session. It's really lovely to be seeing a network of HDR researchers who are joining from all over the world. It's really inspiring to be able to build a network where we have a common interest in research in the arts. So lovely to see you with us today, and go well, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.